Davenport, Iowa, and bringing greetings and blessings from The Table, a church here in Davenport where people are trying to move from greed toward generosity, from violence toward peacemaking, from isolation toward neighborliness, and from fear toward faith. It's good to be sharing a good word with you on this beautiful day. Let's jump right into our scripture, which comes to us from the end of the Gospel of Luke. This story is commonly known as the road to Emmaus, and it takes place on the day of resurrection, Easter Sunday, later in the day. Let's open our hearts and give a good listen. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all of this, it is now the third day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." And then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all of the words that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he appeared to Simon." And then they told what had happened on the road, and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. That day 2 disciples were going to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, talking to each other about everything that had happened. And while they were talking, Jesus himself drew near to them and walked with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. What prevented the disciples from recognizing Jesus? What prevented them from comprehending the resurrection? Well, obviously, they were just stupid, terrible people. Too harsh. Yeah, no. Of course not. Of course they were not stupid. But isn't that a conclusion that we like to jump to when someone doesn't understand and they don't recognize a truth that is fully obvious from our point of view? They don't get it, so they're just the worst. Yeah. Think of your reaction to a person who doesn't get it about something you consider very important and very obvious and easy to understand, right? Basic facts about climate change, or right theology, or guns, or social media, whatever. They don't get it the way that you get it, right? And now ask yourself, how interested are you in contemplating what might be the reasons that they don't see what you see? There's actually a cycle of incomprehension that is created in these situations. I don't understand how you don't understand this, right? The easiest thing to do is to dismiss someone who doesn't recognize the truth as a toxic idiot. Now, I can think of a handful of things, if I put my mind to it, I can think of a few things that may have prevented the disciples from recognizing Jesus on the road to Emmaus. I don't know if any of these is correct, but if I take a moment to think about it, I can come up with a few reasons. Of course, the first one would be that there is some kind of supernatural obscuring filter that was cast over their eyes. It was like a miraculous intervention that prevented them from seeing, what was plain to see. This is the Bible. Things like that do happen in the Bible. Okay, that's the first possibility. Another possibility, which does involve a miracle, but it doesn't necessarily involve them not seeing what was easy to see. Maybe on the road, Jesus did actually look different physically, and maybe his voice actually did sound different after the resurrection than before he was crucified. Okay, so those are, miraculous explanations, right? But there are non-miraculous explanations or possibilities as well. I mean, if you just think about the shock and the grief and the fear that the disciples must have been experiencing that day, and you ask, could it be that they were walking around in a haze of post-traumatic stress, and their faculties and their perceptions were a little bit out of whack in that state? I mean, that is not a crazy possibility to consider. And just another thing that really is on my mind more and more as I get older is the value of sleep, right? And how important sleep is for the healthy functioning of a person and for your brain to work the way a brain is supposed to work. I wonder how sleep deprived these guys were, right? And is it possible that lack of rest strongly affected their thoughts and words and what they were able to comprehend in those tender hours? These are all things that come to my mind. We can imagine possibilities for what prevented the disciples from recognizing Jesus that day on the road, right? But to understand anything, okay, to weigh these different options as more or less likely, to even think through the question of what was going on with these guys, like, we first need to accept that, like it or not, human beings often do not comprehend comprehensible things. Sometimes, right, we don't perceive the perceptible. We don't see things that are right in front of us. This is a thing about people. It's true. And when people are in a state of not seeing things clearly, arguing with them, explaining how backwards their thinking is to them, right? This may not help at all. Sometimes the less someone understands something, the more stubbornly they insist that they do, and that they are absolutely right. Of course, notice this dimension of the story. Jesus is unrecognized on the road to Emmaus. And in this state of being unrecognized, Jesus walked for 7 miles with the disciples and spent the whole trip talking to them about the truth, expounding on the scriptures, explaining the long arc of God's redemptive story to them. He also, I will point out, called them foolish as he explained these things. And at the end of all of that, what is that, 2 hours? How long does it take you to walk 7 miles? Probably longer back then because the roads were different. It was more of a hike than a stroll, right? But at the end of however much time they were walking, 7 miles, they still had not realized who he was. They still had not comprehended from that conversation that the resurrection was in fact real. They didn't understand everything they needed to understand simply because they had it explained to them. Remember this the next time you feel that if you just explained it perfectly, just how wrong or misled or unfair your conversation partner is, right? They will just understand, right? If you just explain it perfectly, they will just accept whatever it is you're trying to tell them, right? These guys on the road, Cleopas and the guy whose name we don't know, like they were disciples of Jesus. Okay? And they were having the resurrection explained to them by Jesus himself. And they didn't get it. Okay. Now, that's not to say that the conversation was useless. Quite the contrary. There was a very important function and a very important outcome to this conversation, despite the fact that the dialogue didn't achieve some like total mutual comprehension in and of itself. Okay? I would say that this conversation was quite successful. Okay? The success of the conversation was that they wanted to keep talking. Yes. They wanted to know more. They wanted to hear more of what this guy they thought was a stranger had to say, right? And they wanted to spend more time with this person with whom they had had such a provocative dialogue. So they arrived at their destination in Emmaus. Jesus proceeded, or at least he acted like he was about to keep walking down the road, right? And the disciples had been so affected by talking to them that they didn't want to see him go. They asked him to please join them for dinner so that they could keep talking. I wonder how our experience of family and community and politics might be a little bit different if our goal was not to end discussion by winning an argument, proving our point, settling the issue, right? Everybody these days wants to own the other side, destroy the other side of any debate. What if instead our goal was to sustain and to expand discussion by investing in enriching and provocative ideas and stories and proposals? Could we measure success by whether we've been able to keep a conversation going? This would be a pivot from answering questions, settling an issue, full stop, toward imagining possibilities. How would you feel if you talked to someone for an hour and they still didn't see things like you do? They still didn't really understand your point. They definitely didn't agree with you as a result of all the time you had spent talking to them, but they felt so enriched by talking to you that at the end of all that, they wanted to have you stay for dinner at their house, right? and keep talking. If that happened, would you feel like you had failed to get through to them? I hope you would not feel that way. The walk to Emmaus, it offers a glimpse of a value proposition here, okay? Because as the story comes to its close, eventually, right, after this very long walk, comprehension, understanding did finally descend upon the disciples in this story. They did eventually get it about Jesus and the resurrection. Okay? Hours of talking it, going round and round and round in the dialogue, did not cause a light bulb to switch on. This dialogue did not activate an epiphany, but it did get them to the table. They sat down and they broke bread together. And there, in the space of hospitality, in the space of neighborly welcome and fellowship, right? In the space where bread is broken and shared, right? In the space of Holy Communion, where human individuals create beloved community, it was then that the eyes of the disciples were opened, the Savior was seen and known, the truth of the resurrection was recognized, and grace was made plain. When he was at the table with them, he broke bread, blessed and broke it, and he gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. It's a beautiful story that invites us to trust that chasms of incomprehension can be bridged. Do you believe it?